here. My name is Adam McGill. I'm the city manager for the City of Novato, and we welcome everyone to joining us tonight for our community budget workshop, where we're going to present a broad view of the budget to the community and answer questions and seek your input. So the format tonight will be when I'm finished speaking, we will hear from our finance director, Amy Cunningham, who will walk us through a broad perspective of the budget and what we're looking at and the considerations that we're undertaking now. And then when she's finished, you'll hear from our city engineer and public works director, Chris Blunk, who will walk us through the capital improvement projects and that budget. And you'll hear about some of the big items that are planned and how they're funded, which ones are short, and for you to consider and provide input and questions as well. Once Chris finishes, all of the department heads will come on the screen, and we'll all be available to you to hear your input and your comments, as well as answer any questions that you may have. And that portion will be facilitated by Assistant City Manager Jessica DeKine. So we'll call on you. Those of you who are accustomed to these meetings or council meetings, raise your hand to alert us that you have something to say. And Jessica will call on you when it's your turn, and you'll have the option to even turn your camera on in this workshop, as we want it to be a little more interactive than a typical council meeting. So we'll allow you to turn your camera on and unmute you, and you can make your comments and your questions, and then we'll go on to the next person. And also, before we get started with Amy, I'd like to recognize that we have a number of our council members with us tonight. Not all of them were able to be here with us due to other commitments, but Mayor Eklund is here, Mayor Pro Tem Lucan is here, and Council Member Peel is with us tonight. So they'll be in the background learning and listening with you. This is your night to provide your questions and comments, and we'll all be taking that in as we take the budget down the road to the council and prepare that for you based on some of your input. So with that, I'd like to introduce our finance director, Amy Cunningham, and she'll take us from here with the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Adam. Doing a quick share screen here. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, evening. Again, I'm Amy Cunningham, the city's finance director. Tonight, we will be doing just some kind of an overview of the city's budget information and where and how things have changed since the pandemic has hit us. Quick overview of the agenda here. Well, Adam has done the welcome. Thank you for that, Adam. We'll go through the operating budget, and then Chris Blunk, the Public Works Director, will go through the capital improvement program. Again, we'll do the question and answer session and talk about next steps in the process. Here we go. So public input is a critical element of the annual budget development process. That's why we're here today with you. The budget is intended to reflect the community's priorities, allocating available funds to those service areas that are most important to the residents, businesses, and visitors to the community. In addition to this workshop, there are several more opportunities for you to participate in public meetings. Dates of the upcoming meetings are shown on this slide. In addition to these meetings, the city has a finance oversight committee. That committee meets the third Thursday of each month at 7:30 in the morning. If you'd like to join us, please do. It's a little bit early, but we're there and eager to listen. The finance committee discusses and provides information on the annual budget. There we go. My mouse wasn't working for a second. So now we'll move on to discussing the operating budget. The table on this slide provides a snapshot of the city's 2021 general fund budget as amended in September of 2020. I'm going to throw a couple of dates out here at you a couple of times. June when the budget was adopted, and September when the budget was revised. Our focus on the general fund, we focus primarily on the general fund because this is the fund that supports the operating budget. There are no restrictions on the use of this fund, and the council can dedicate how to allocate these monies. Other categories called restricted funds, something like gas tax, can only be used for specific purposes. Usually those restrictions are put in place by other regulating or granting agencies. The general fund doesn't have these restrictions. And again, the general fund is our primary source of support, financial support for our ongoing operations. On this slide, you can see the projected deficit for fiscal year 2021 is approximately $2.5 million. Of that $2.5 million, 400 consists of one-time expenses. Therefore, the ongoing deficit is closer to $2.1 million. As I mentioned, this reflects the budget as of September 2020. The deficit was actually significantly more in June at $5.7 million. That $5.7 million was a result of impacts from the pandemic, in addition to several other factors. One being depletion of Measure F, the city's prior local sales tax. Measure F was being used to support ongoing operating expenses. However, those funds again are depleted now. And second, a general flattening of revenue along with increasing expenses. Because of the rapidly changing nature of the pandemic and the uncertainty surrounding how long the social distancing and other restrictions would be in place, in June, the council decided to adopt a carryover budget, a budget similar to what was in place in the prior year. They wanted to take some time to study how best to reduce that deficit. This slide shows how revenue and expense have compared year over year since fiscal year 2010-2011. You can see that revenue and expense have been close each year, with revenue coming in slightly more than expense until fiscal year 1920, when they were just about even, when revenue and expense were just about even. Even prior to the pandemic, the budget was tightening. This chart shows the budget changed in how the budget changed in fiscal year 2021 based on the City Council's actions to address the deficit. Again, back to that June-September change. The green bar represents revenue and the gray bar represents expense. In September, the council made over $3 million in reductions, including staff, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and ultimately reduced the projected deficit to $2.5 million. Again, approximately 400,000 of that deficit included one-time costs. So we're saying that the projected ongoing deficit is closer to 2.1 million. I'll now go into a little more detail about general fund revenues. We'll spend quite a bit of time on this slide actually. Property tax at 42% of general fund revenue, or 16 million, is the largest share of city revenue. For the current year, property tax is tracking as expected, and we do expect to hit our budgeted target by June 30th. Generally, it takes 18 to 24 months for outside economic factors to impact property tax revenue. This is due to the timing of when property valuations are completed, issuance of property tax bills, and when the city ultimately receives its portion of these funds. Since this is one of our larger shares of revenue, we're fortunate that we would have some time to plan ahead if we expected a decline in this category. The next category here is sales tax. Sales tax is 32% of general fund revenue, or about $12.5 million. Sales tax is the city's second largest share of revenue. And as you would expect, we've seen pandemic-related impacts to this revenue stream. For this year's budget, we reduced our projections in June and September. We, like many cities, use sales tax consultants that analyze revenue and economic trends and provide us with quarterly projections. The good news is that our latest projections through the second quarter of the fiscal year, so for us, that's December of 2020, the latest projections indicate we will exceed our budget. Currently, the consultants believe will be approximately $500,000 more than the existing amended budget. This increase is primarily because there's been exponential growth in online sales during the pandemic, as you would expect. In addition, a new law requiring out-of-state companies to charge sales tax on online sales went into effect this last year. So a good timing for that new law. It helped offset some of the local declines that we've seen. We do expect to have updated projections on sales tax in mid-May. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go back. So sorry about that. Hotel or TOT tax is 4% of general fund revenue, or about 1.3 million. While it's not a lot of revenue, I did want to take a moment to talk about this area. Obviously, the pandemic's had a significant impact on travel. Declining occupancy at Novato hotels has reduced the amount of TOT revenue the city receives. As restrictions continue to loosen, we're hopeful we'll see some recovery here. Currently, TOT is projected to be approximately 350,000 under the budget amount. So fortunately, our sales tax is offsetting that decline in the TOT. Now I can change the slide. This slide depicts some of our one-time funds. This year, which is unusual, the city expects to receive approximately 18.2 million in one-time funds. The chart on this slide breaks down the different categories. For 18-19 general fund savings, this is savings that was identified after the city's books were closed for the year. The general fund savings there was about just under $1 million. We also had one-time monies come in from a Buck Center development agreement. $500,000 here is the balance of unallocated funds associated with that. We had property sale. We did expect that this property would sell, but not quite as soon as it did. The Hamilton commissary parcel, it's again sold slightly earlier than anticipated, and we received approximately $5.7 million, again in one-time money. The Federal American Rescue Plan, preliminarily we'll receive about $10.4 million from this program. The amount is subject to change, and the full parameters on how the funds can be used are not yet available. We're waiting for the Treasury to provide us with some additional details there. Generally, the purpose of these monies is to offset revenue impacts associated with the pandemic. These funds can be used in place of the city's emergency or rainy day fund to offset the deficit. The city will receive the monies in 2 allocations, 12 months apart. We're hopeful that the initial funds will come in this fiscal year. We're getting close to maybe not meeting that deadline, but we are guaranteed at least some level of funding from this program. And the last one that I wanted to highlight here was the CARES Act. These monies were directed to the city from the federal government last summer to assist in offsetting pandemic-related costs. These funds were used in September to offset the deficit. So those monies aren't available. They've already been allocated out. One-time funds are, as defined, one-time in nature and should not be used to support ongoing services. The city has a number of areas in which one-time funds can and should be allocated. This helps kind of strengthen our fiscal foundation, set us up for the future, and smooth any expense spikes that may happen as the years go on. This slide lists some of those areas. First, we would want to address the loss of revenue associated with the pandemic by using the American Rescue Plan monies rather than the emergency or rainy day fund to backfill that deficit. Second, replenish our reserves that have been depleted. Fortunately, the rainy day fund meets the city council's minimum balance, but the insurance reserve is depleted. The reserve is used to offset costs of settlements that are not or exceed the city's insurance coverage. So if we have some kind of legal settlement that exceeds the insurance the city currently carries, this fund would be used to offset those costs rather than having to dip into operating budget expense. Address long-term liabilities. The council's created 2 trusts to address OPEB. OPEB is other post-employment benefits, and our pension liability costs. Investing in these areas reduces the city's liability and can help smooth costs, thereby reducing the impact on the operating budget in future years. Capital needs, the Public Works Director will be getting into this in more detail. The city has a long list of unfunded capital needs that really need to be addressed for a variety of reasons. And last, here's kind of a broad category, but technology and other initiatives. This includes things such as investing in technology security upgrades. Government agencies, as you're probably aware, are a prime target of hackers. So we want to make sure that we are as secure as we can be. And of course, other technology upgrades that improve services within the community. So we talked a little bit about one-time funds. We do have some new ongoing funds to talk about as well. And the City Council's been working on a variety of strategies to generate ongoing revenue to offset the city's growing expense. This slide shows some of the areas where new ongoing revenue can be expected. The city could expect to see about $663,000 in new revenue next year. Measure Q, voter approved TOT increase at 2%. This is the city's hotel tax. It was approved by voters last November. This 2% increase will generate additional ongoing revenue to support services. Measure Q became effective January 1st, so we aren't really sure quite yet how much additional revenue it will be generating for the current fiscal year, but we're hopeful it will be somewhere close to that $200,000 mark. Measure Q will be even more helpful in the future as travel recovers. And there are two new hotels, construction of two new hotels in the pipeline. The first hotel is currently expected to open in spring, summer of 2022. And obviously the construction schedule is subject to change, but we do believe that we'll see some new revenue towards the end of next fiscal year and new visitors to town. So that'll be nice as well. Community development is working on a short-term rental ordinance. Once that's in place, we'll receive TOT from those rentals as well. A new sales tax, a new project has been recently approved by the council. Overall, this project is expected to generate about $100,000 next fiscal year. And if construction stays on schedule, about $400,000 in future years. So we'll have a little bit of a boost to our ongoing sales tax there. And finally, cannabis, community development, hard at work still, has been working on a cannabis permitting process. And again, if those businesses stay on schedule, we can expect to see about $66,000 in new revenue next year. And as approved businesses begin to open, this revenue stream will continue to grow. Just touching a little bit on property tax. We've talked a little bit about what to expect in the future. Now I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the city's tax structure. Novato has one of the lowest shares of the basic property tax in Marin County. This is because of the timing of the city's incorporation and some decisions made by the city's forefathers. Prior to Prop 13, cities could establish their own property tax rate. And between 1975 and 1979, the council reduced the rate by 19%, which locked us into this lower rate going forward. This slide shows Novato's share of property taxes compared to other cities in the county. You can see that Novato's 7% is well below other cities, including San Rafael, which is at 12.2%. Mill Valley receives the highest share at 25.8%. So looking at 7% to 25.8%, it's clear and evident that the city's share is not adequate to support ongoing services on its own. This is the well-known dollar bill proportional share of property tax that is shown in a lot of different presentations, but it gives you a good idea of how the $1 of property tax that you're paying is allocated out. You can see that Novato at 7% receives this I gotta start that over. You can see that Novato at 7% receives the smallest portion of your property tax dollar. Novato schools at 31% receive the largest, and Novato Fire District receives twice the city's share at 14.5%. I'm going to pause for a second and take a drink. Maybe I can talk better. Finally, I wanted to show you this slide about sales tax. Here you can see how the 8.5% sales tax rate is distributed. The city receives 1.25% of the overall rate. 1% is Novato's share of the general sales tax, the Bradley-Byrne sales tax. And 0.25% is from voter approved Measure C. This is a local sales tax measure that the city does not need to share with these other entities on here. Measure C at 25 cents replaced Measure F that was at 50 cents. Loss of Measure F revenue has had a detrimental impact in the city's finances, which I touched on in the prior revenue slides. As I mentioned earlier, the City Council's been working on ways to generate additional revenue and stabilize the city's budget. Last February, just prior to the pandemic, the council directed staff to explore the 5 areas listed here. TOT, the hotel tax, as I mentioned before, was passed by voters in November. Thank you for supporting this effort. That's definitely going to help us, sorry about that, help us as we move forward. Staff continues to explore these other areas and provide periodic updates to the council on our efforts. And those areas that would generate ongoing revenue are the most critical, obviously, to maintaining city services as expenses continue to rise and the pandemic recovery continues to evolve. Moving on to quickly touch on our expenses. As mentioned earlier, the City Council reduced the operating budget expense by over $3 million in September. This slide shows the city's expenses by category. Personnel costs at 73% or $29 million are clearly the city's biggest expense. This makes sense because the city is a service organization and services are provided through our people, through the staff here. We continue to look for ways to contain costs and identify cost-saving measures. As our ongoing revenue improves, it will not help us to get to a balanced budget if we can't contain our expenses. So we may be able to increase our revenues, but if our revenues increase as well as our expenses, we aren't gaining any ground. My last slide here shows how the city's personnel cost has changed over the last 3 years. You can see how the total personnel count has decreased from just over 208 employees in fiscal year 18-19 and is currently 188.5. In September, the council eliminated 17 positions and an over 8% reduction in personnel. These are personnel who are providing services to the community. This was a difficult but necessary decision to reduce ongoing expense. However, even with these staffing reductions, we continue to be committed to providing you with the best service that we can. And with that, I'm turning the presentation over to our Public Works Director, City Engineer Chris Blanc, who will provide an overview of the city's capital program.
Thanks, Amy. You can go ahead and move to the next slide there. We'll go ahead and jump right in. And thanks to everyone that's joined us tonight. I'm Chris Blanc, I'm the Public Works Director, and I'm going to try to give a high-level overview here of the Capital Improvement Program budget, which we update every year. It's a 5-year capital planning tool. We use this to park our large projects with one-time expenditures typically, rather than keeping those things in the operating budget like Amy just went through. We do update the program every year along with the operating budget, so through the same process. And I should say we go through this process kind of on an ongoing basis through community feedback that we receive and reports and things that we get, but we do one big heavy update every year. So we prioritize projects, we look at projects to receive funding based on regulatory mandates, the status of approved projects, whether they may need additional funding carrying over into the next year if the scope has changed. We also, as I mentioned, have planning documents, reports, and community input, council direction, strategic plans that guide us to move projects in and out of the CIP. And then the capital revenue limitations and restrictions that we have on a lot of those special revenue funds drive which projects can proceed and which can't, typically based on how much money we have available. So before I get into too much of the budget itself, I want to talk a little bit about a couple major projects. We get a lot of questions about these projects on a regular basis. Everyone always wants to know what's going on with Novato Boulevard widening. It is still moving. It's moving along actually really well right now. We have a consultant-led team that is doing a great job of coordinating all of the utility work that has to happen underneath the roadway. So we're working on that behind the scenes. All of that utility coordination work will allow us to update the project description in the EIR and the environmental document. And then we hope to have that circulating publicly for comment by late this year. So it's getting close. After that, we have about a year of right-of-way acquisition and high-level design work that has to happen. And then we're hoping to go to construction in 2023 on this project. Another big project that is getting started very soon here is our San Marin Drive resurfacing project. That's basically from Simmons Lane all the way out to San Marin High School with a couple gaps in there. We expect sidewalk work to begin, the concrete work will begin later this month toward the end of April. And then probably right after the 4th of July, I think we'll see the pavement resurfacing begin. And we are working hard to try to complete this project before the first day of school, which is August 17th in 2021. So a few other capital projects, some updates on them. Grant Avenue Bridge widening project. This project is basically on the shelf, shovel ready. We are awaiting federal funding for construction through the Federal Highway Bridge Program. Novato Boulevard improvements at Vintage Oaks. This was recently approved by the council, and we are planning to advertise for construction bids during the month of May, so coming up very soon here. Our downtown Grant Avenue amenities, this includes all the new tree lights, the new waste receptacles, and several other improvements that the downtown community's asked for, and that really make that a nice vibrant part of the community. We anticipate having that completed by the end of the year here. We'll probably do a little bit of scope change on that project to add some, we're talking about adding some gates to be able to close off Grant Avenue as opposed to using the water-filled barricades that we've been doing with the COVID-related weekend closures. So have some more flexibility to be able to shut down Grant Avenue for community events going forward. We are still working actively on the Lieb Community Garden, finalizing the environmental document on that project. The design work for the project is basically done. We need to wrap up the environmental document and then hope to be in construction late this year, probably early next year. But we'd really like to have that done so that folks are putting vegetables in the ground the right time of the year in the spring. Olive Avenue widening. This project is also moving forward. We're coordinating with the developer there next to the Trader Joe's. And there's quite a bit of riparian habitat mitigation that has to happen. So we're working closely with the regulatory agencies to get all of our permits in place for that project. I don't have a great estimate on the construction schedule. I'm guessing probably 2023. It has a lot to do with the regulatory permits that we need to get and how long that takes us before we can get started. And finally, I'll mention that we've been very actively working on our traffic signals. All 38 city traffic signals now either have yellow reflective backplates installed, or they actually have backup generators installed so that we have safety enhancements in place during power outages. It's very important that we try to get that done before the next fire season here. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some additional funding needs that we have in addition to all of the projects that are in the pipeline. And there's roughly 50 capital improvement projects in the current program. We have a newer project, the Novato Boulevard at San Marin Sutro improvements. So that includes the intersection as well as closing the sidewalk gap along Sutro Avenue. We've applied for 2 grants for this project. We need about $1 million for construction. Unfortunately, we were denied in both of the grant applications that we submitted so far. So we are still looking for funding for that project. Like I said, about $1.1 million for construction. We have a large list of crosswalk enhancements and traffic calming measures that we'd like to make based on community requests that we've received over the past few years, as well as quite a few more that came in during the pandemic with a lot of people working from home and out and about in the community. So we've made commitments to several neighborhoods to try to deliver those traffic calming measures and crosswalk enhancements. And so we're looking for funding to be able to put a large project out and try to take care of as much of that as we can. We also have a report that's identified that quite a bit of our play structure equipment at our playgrounds, 16 playgrounds we have in Novato, they don't meet current standards for play structures. And so we've identified a need really to go in and take a look at our play structures and upgrade components and pieces of equipment so that we bring them up to current standards. And we're anticipating that we need about $1 million to do that. Play structure equipment's very expensive, and a lot of times when you touch one piece, you have to touch another piece. So it tends to have a snowball effect on those projects. Again, Novato Boulevard multi-use path, looking at partnering with the county to widen and improve that pathway, as well as possibly change the alignment to make it more comfortable for folks moving back and forth between kind of the west end of Novato Boulevard there in the city, all the way out to Stafford Lake Park. So we anticipate the portion within the city limits would be about $750,000. And then we have municipal buildings that are in need of some exterior painting and work in order for us to preserve those buildings. We did a bunch of work at the police department last year. It looks great. City Hall got painted last year as well. It also turned out great. Our admin building now has that full southern exposure, and we're noticing that it's about time for it to be painted as well. So about $600,000 we believe we've got in that project. Also some work at Margaret Todd Senior Center and Hill Gym needs to take place. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about our capital improvement revenues. I think Amy mentioned this up at the beginning, that we have some special revenues that come into the city that really are earmarked for capital projects. So gas tax, for example, we have the Transportation Authority of Marin Transportation Measure AA sales tax that has specific uses for streets and sidewalks. There's Parks Measure A, County Parks Measure A funding that comes in for parks and recreation purposes. So as these funds come in, this is what we use to fund our capital projects, try to line up the scope of work that needs to be performed with the type of funding that comes in. The gas taxes are really one of our largest revenues that come in. They support our paving projects, they support our sidewalk projects, the traffic calming measures, crosswalks, all that type of work. We saw during the pandemic, now that we're starting to see the actual numbers come in as we get to the end of the fiscal year, that we're off of this year about $160,000 from what we had anticipated prior to the pandemic, what we thought we'd see. So it's about a 13% reduction in those funds this current fiscal year. We also saw, because of the deficit that Amy mentioned, that we had a reduction of about 50% in long-term maintenance funding that typically supports things like city parks and buildings. So that was off $500,000 in order to reduce the general fund deficit this current fiscal year. So it's about a 50% reduction across the board. I think if you averaged all of the capital revenues that come in, we were probably about 20% off this fiscal year from where we thought we'd be. But as you can see on this, different revenues that came in had different impacts. We are expecting, or our projections at least for this upcoming fiscal year, that the total new capital revenues coming in would be about $3.3 million. And that's actually very similar to our pre-pandemic 2021 estimates. So basically, January a year ago, before any of us had any idea how much our lives would change, we were looking at very similar revenue projections to what we're actually looking at now for 21-22. So it's put us about a year behind in growth, we believe, the pandemic has. And obviously, because of some of the capital needs that I mentioned before, we are recommending the use of some of the city's one-time fundings to help us catch up and take care of some of these priorities that we have. And I think that's it for my slides, Amy, and we can go into public questions and comments. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Chris. My name is Jessica DeKine. I'm the Assistant City Manager here for the City of Novato. And in addition to myself and our City Manager, we have my colleagues from all of our city departments here available to answer any budget-related questions that you might have this evening. To ask a question, I'm just going to read our script to remind folks some Zoom etiquette. So please use the raised hand option on your screen to request to speak. I will call on you by name, and one of the folks behind the screen here will help unmute you. And then you will be unmuted and allowed to turn on your camera if you would like when you are asking your question. If there's anyone calling in, which I don't see any call-in users, but just in case, you can use *9 to request to speak and *6 to unmute yourself when called on. So if for some reason you have a question that we were unable to answer during this Q&A portion, we will be posting all the questions and answers from tonight at novato.org/budget. So we'll be sure to get those answers included before we post. So I will pause and look for some raised hands to call on. I am not, oh, good. Mark Millberg, thank you so much for being our brave first question asker.
Hi, thank you very much. Really insightful presentation. Thank you guys so much for putting it all together. I have a question about the new project sales tax. I just was curious, who exactly would be paying that tax? How would it be applied?
I'm going to hand that over, I believe, to Amy Cunningham to answer. Amy, is that in your realm?
Sure. So that would be sales tax. So people who are making purchases at the new project would be generating those additional sales tax revenues.
Sorry, I muted myself again. So just to confirm that, so it's any new project regardless of size? I mean, there's no categorization of who it gets applied to?
Yeah, this is sales tax associated with a specific new project that was approved at Vintage Oaks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
And
for
I
your
have one other
question.
question, if I may.
Oh yeah, please do, yes.
I was curious, when we talk about replenishing the reserves in the outstanding liabilities and needs slide, Amy, do you have a dollar amount in mind? I know you've talked about, the possibility of having to replenish the reserves, but do you have an actual dollar amount that you'd like to see?
Yeah, I do. In fact, we're putting hopefully the finishing touches on a staff report that the council will consider on Tuesday evening that outlines all of those one-time revenues and provides some suggested areas for those different for those funds to be allocated. And it is all to, one-time monies for one-time things. So that report is in its final stages, that it should be made public on Friday.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Again, excellent presentation.
Thank you, Mark, for your question. We appreciate it. I'm looking for other hands raised. I'm not seeing any just now, but we can pause for a minute and wait for folks. Wonderful. That's a familiar name. Madeline Kellner has a question for us. We can't hear you just yet. Can someone unmute Madeline?
I just did myself.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm just curious, since I was around when we got Measure F passed, and then when I was leaving council, it went to the quarter, and I must say I didn't vote for the quarter. I would have voted for the half. And I'm just wondering what's the temperature like right now for re-examining and getting back on, a 1/2-cent sales tax for the public to consider.
I appreciate that question. I'm going to hand that to Adam McGill to answer.
And Madeline and everyone else. So that is one of the items that the council in February of 20 did direct us to explore. And then obviously the pandemic hit, a month later. So we couldn't put anything on this year's ballot anyway, based on the new, criteria of when it has to fall on an election. So the earliest we could ask the voters that would be November of 22. So the council will be providing some direction on that. I would expect either later this year or very early 22. So it is definitely still in the, we have direction from the council to continue to consider that and explore that.
Thank you. Pausing to see if we have any other raised hands tonight.
Jessica, we could also invite, in addition to questions, if anyone just has any comment, areas that, don't you dare cut any of those services, or areas that, if we had to, you could live with some reduction in service. So we're open to your feedback as well. It doesn't have to be a question. Or we just did such an amazing job tonight that everyone is satisfied.
Hopefully everyone took the budget priority survey that was open for about 3 weeks on the city website. That did close this afternoon. So that was also an opportunity for the community to provide input on their budget thoughts and priorities. And if you didn't, there are some upcoming public meetings that you can also express your opinion if you're still kind of considering and thinking about it right now.
Just going to quickly remind folks to raise your hand. There's a little hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And sometimes when you're looking in this format, it goes away. So if you hover your mouse, if you're on a computer, along the bottom of the screen, you'll see raise hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. Adam, do you want me to do the thank you for coming, or?
Yeah, let's, do we have a slide that has the future dates for public input? Maybe let's throw that up.
Great.
So people can take some notes. This Tuesday night is a big budget night at the council meeting, April 13th. So we'll be talking in a lot more detail about much of the information you heard tonight. So if you want to see what the council says and what action or direction they give us, certainly tune in on the 13th, and you can of course provide public comment that night as well. Or prior to the meeting, Amy mentioned the agenda will be posted, visible late Thursday night, but certainly Friday. And our e-comment feature, right embedded in the agenda, is really the best way to, the council gets that near immediately your comment. So we'd encourage you to use the e-comment. If you don't want to publicly speak or say anything directly, you can always write us a note, and that's a great way to do that. And the council, all 5 of them, gets that near immediately after you hit enter. So along with us, the staff as well. So so maybe we just share the dates and thank everyone for coming. This is not the end. There's still plenty of opportunities. I mentioned Tuesday the 13th, and then we'll be back again on the 11th, and June 8th and June 22nd. But you don't have to wait for those days. You can always email us, as we mentioned, and give us your input and let us know what you're thinking. So we hope you'll continue to join us and learn and provide your input. I guess a final call. I don't see any hands either there, Jessica.
I don't. So I will say thank you so much for joining us this evening. A recording of this workshop will be broadcast on Novato Community Television Channel 27 and will be posted online at novato.org/budget along with the Q&A. There's also, again, if you missed those dates or you couldn't see the slide, if you visit us at novato.org/budget, you can see all the upcoming budget meetings to engage with us. And we thank you again for joining us this evening.